Tara, I think you can tell us what's next.
Sure. Our next panel is moderated by Fred Conrad. For those of you with an older version of the agenda, panels 3 and 4, we swapped places in the agenda. So we've got managing panels up next.
Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We have 3 talks in this session. First is by Fabienne Kraemer. Fabienne completed her bachelor's degree in sociology and media and communication studies at the University of Mannheim in Germany, received her master's degree in sociology and empirical social research at the University of Cologne. Fabienne's currently a PhD student in the survey design and methodology department at GISIS, Leibniz Institute of the Social Sciences, where she conducts research about the mechanisms of panel conditioning in longitudinal studies. Her talk today is entitled Assessing Panel Conditioning in the GISIS Panel, Comparing Respondents with Different Levels of Experience. Fabienne, over to you.
So welcome everyone to my talk about assessing panel conditioning in the GISIS panel, comparing respondents with different levels of experience. So first of all, I'd like to give some background information on the relevance of our research and as to why we are investigating panel conditioning and what panel conditioning effects basically are. So we might all know longitudinal surveys represent the major data source for social and various other fields of research. But they do have a major methodological drawback, which is panel conditioning. Panel conditioning jeopardizes the validity and quality of survey responses, and panel conditioning effects hereby are the artificial changes in respondents' actual behavior, attitudes, and knowledge, or in how they are reported by the respondents, and those artificial changes are caused solely by prior survey participation. So this might be especially a problem for large-scale and widely used panel studies, where a multitude of analysis is based on the respective data, and where also panel conditioning can affect a multitude of those analyses. So consequently, we aim at investigating 2 central research questions. We want to find out if panel conditioning effects exist within the GISIS panel, which here serves as an example for a German widely used large-scale panel. And we want to find out how large are the effects. And secondly, we want to know how do panel conditioning effects affect the overall response quality. So coming to our theoretical assumptions, with respect to positive conditioning, we assume that more experienced respondents provide more accurate and reliable answers. We assume that they are more familiar with the survey content and the survey process, which is possibly due to the fact that they engage in more reflection processes or in further information search on the survey topics. Possibly this is triggered by prior survey participation. Secondly, we assume decreased socially desirable responding, which we assume among the experienced respondents due to their increased trust in the survey itself or the survey sponsors. And consequently, we assume that they are more willing to reveal socially undesirable information about themselves. With respect to negative conditioning, we assume increased satisficing response behavior, possibly due to the wish to reduce survey burden. And we also expect increased motivated misreporting, which he refers to misreporting to questions that trigger multiple follow-up questions. Now coming to our data, as already mentioned before, we draw on the GISIS panel. The GISIS panel is a probability-based mixed mode access panel. It is running since 2014 and nowadays comprises about 5,200 panelists. Refreshment samples are drawn in 2016 and 2018. This sample consists of German-speaking population that is aged 18 years and older and who is permanently residing in Germany. Data is collected via web-based surveys and via mail surveys. And referring to the panel interval, the survey is administered every 2 months and longitudinal course studies are administered annually. So now coming to the survey experience, as already mentioned before, 2 cohorts, 2 refreshment samples have been incorporated later on in the panel. So ending up with 3 cohorts in total, which we want to compare to each other. So first we have the first cohort, which in our case is the high experience group. It was recruited in 2013 and from 2014 on responds to the consecutive regular waves of the panel. Then we have the second cohort, which is medium experienced. It was recruited in 2016 and responds to the regular waves from 2016 on. And then lastly, we have the low experienced cohort, which is recruited or was recruited in 2018 and from there on responds to the regular waves. So 2018 represents the perfect time point for us to compare the different respondent groups, because we have a difference in survey experience as follows. The first cohort responds to the questionnaire the 5th time. The second cohort, the medium experience group, responds to the 3rd time, and the low experience group responds to the very first time to the questionnaire. So specifically, we draw on the 29th panel wave here. That includes a core study on media usage and work and leisure. Now coming to the operationalization and methods, we used the following indicators with respect to positive conditioning and reflection processes. We investigated the prevalence of don't know answers, since we assumed that more experienced respondents show a lower prevalence. And with respect to optimizing, we investigated the response latencies across the cohorts. And with respect to decreased socially desirable responding, we investigated item non-response and sensitive questions as a measure for that. With respect to increased satisfying response behavior, we investigated the amount of speeding and non-differentiation between the groups. And with regard to motivated misreporting, we investigated the number of non-triggered filter questions. And lastly said here, to account for panel attrition, we applied propensity score weighting to balance the covariates between groups. Now coming to our results, first of all, the prevalence of don't know answers. As already mentioned, we assumed that high experience respondents show a lower prevalence since they engaged in further information search on the topic or whatsoever. But here we can see that we did not find any significant differences between the groups. So moving on to response latencies, here we assumed that more experienced respondents show lower response latencies due to optimizing process, due to an optimized survey process. And here we do in fact see a significant difference between the low experience group and the high experience group, showing that the low experience group significantly took longer time to complete the questionnaire. Then coming to satisfying response behavior and to speeding in particular, we could also show that there is a significant difference between the groups in speeding, and the pattern shows that high experienced respondents show more speeding than medium experienced, and medium experienced respondents show more speeding than low experienced respondents. Now coming to non-differentiation, here we also found evidence we also found a significant difference between the high experience and the low experience group, and we found evidence that the high experience group shows more non-differentiation compared to the low experience group, also speaking hinting for an increased satisfying response behavior among the high experience group. Then coming to moderated misreporting, we also assume that the high experienced respondents or the more experienced cohorts show more misreporting, which in fact we could not provide evidence for. We did not find any significant difference between the groups referring to moderated misreporting. And last but not least, we investigated item non-response and sensitive questions. Here we drew on a different databases. We drew on a different panel wave, in particular that only covers 2 of the prior investigated 3 cohorts. And here we can see that the high experience group shows more item non-response compared to the medium experience group. And this difference is also significant. In fact, it is contrary to what we expected. Since we expected that item non-response or socially desirable responding is decreasing with greater survey experience. So summing up, with respect to positive conditioning, we could not find any evidence for reflection processes that lead to a lower prevalence of don't know answers among experienced respondents. We could find evidence for an optimized survey process since we found shorter response latencies with greater survey experience. Referring to socially desirable responding, we did not find they are decreasing or that it is decreasing with greater survey experience. With respect to increased satisfying response behavior, we could find evidence for higher amount of speeding and non-differentiation among the more experienced respondents. And coming to motivated misreporting, we could not find any evidence. But as already mentioned before, with regard to socially desirable responding, we could find significant differences, but contrary to what we expected, indeed, we saw that it is increasing with greater survey experience. So what are the take-home messages? There is evidence for positive as well as negative panel conditioning, but overall, most effects are relatively small, and they are partly caused by specific question formats, like thinking of the non-differentiation that only takes place in grid, or that only takes place in grid questions. However, speeding shows relatively large effects, and we find greater SD bias with greater survey experience. Here, we definitely need to further investigate the underlying effects and the underlying mechanisms that give rise to those patterns. And lastly said, it is not clear if respondents have been conditioned on the survey content or the survey process. So here we definitely need true randomized experiments to further differentiate the effects and the mechanisms. Yes, so that was my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to receive any remarks or questions.
Yeah, thank you, Fabienne. That's great. While we wait for questions in the chat, I just have a couple. Would you say that the slower response times for the low experienced group is evidence of higher or lower quality data? They're speeding less, which could be related to their longer response times, but this could also mean they're struggling and stumbling through an unfamiliar experience. What do you think about the interpretation of longer response times?
Since we excluded outliers on the response times itself, so that we could definitely differentiate the effects of speeding and response latency, so that we could differentiate there a bit better. So I do think that it is hinting at positive conditioning in this case, but of course, this is something we could also dig in deeper.
So the least experienced cohort is producing higher quality data. That's your interpretation than the more experienced cohort who's responding more quickly.
In general, I think it's a mixed pattern, because we also see an increased satisfying response behavior. So there is, as I said, when it comes to positive conditioning, this is the point. We only can assume that decreased response latency speak for an optimized response process, but we do not know any further. So this is something we definitely need to look at it in depth to find out what are the underlying mechanisms for this, and if it is really positive conditioning, or if it is something that is in fact negative and makes respondents is actually like a sign of the respondents that are struggling with the survey process and survey content, and or basically just speeding through it. It could also be possible.
Thanks. Also, I think it was your very last point, or it was on the last slide, the distinction between conditioning due to content versus, I guess, experience, content versus process. Can you say a little more about that?
Well, yes, there's always the question if respondents are particularly conditioned on the content, meaning that it is the explicit same questions they are answering. Many panels do have repeating core questions that are repeating in every wave or in every second wave. And it is the question if it is the content that respondents are conditioned about, the specific attitudes they are asked about, or if it's solely the process. If it's solely that they are used to replying online, for example, online surveys, or how a survey is structured, something like this. So this is something that most of the time you can't really differentiate. And for this, you definitely need experiments where respondents are in the panel for the same time, but receive different questions, so that you can differentiate the effects for that.
Good. Thank you. So there is a question in the chat. Beyond speed checks, did you have other satisficing checks in place? Red herring, etc.
The satisficing response behavior, we also looked at non-differentiation and also motivated misreporting as a specific form of it, but I'm not sure if I did get the question right.
Justin, do you want to clarify? Oh, he said, Justin said yes.
Okay.
You respond. Great. So we have just a couple of seconds. Is there another question from anyone in the audience? Well, if not, please join me in thanking Fabienne very much for a great presentation. We appreciate it.